The bone pile told the story. Archaeologists were working at a site called Goose, or Garden under Sandet, in Greenland's western settlement. It translates to the farm beneath the sand. The sand had buried this Norse farmstead sometime in the late 14th century, preserving a final, desperate chapter. In the middens, the trash heaps, they found the bones of the animals the family had eaten. For the first few centuries, the piles were full of sheep, goat, and caribou bones. But in the layers dated to around 1350, something changed. The cattle bones appeared. Cattle were a Viking's treasure. They were difficult to keep alive in Greenland's harsh climate. They required precious winter fodder, which meant back-breaking work cutting and drying hay on short, unpredictable summer days. A cow was a status symbol. It gave milk, butter, and cheese. You only ate a cow if you were celebrating a wedding, a funeral, or if you were utterly out of options. Seeing their bones in the trash heap meant the people at GUS were out of options, but there was something else in that final layer, something more chilling. Mixed in with the cattle bones were the bones of dogs, not just any dogs. These were Norwegian elk hounds, valuable hunting partners. Their bones had been split lengthwise, the same way a person splits a caribou bone, to get at the marrow. To suck out the last bit of fat and protein, a Norseman did not eat his hunting dog. The dog helped him hunt seals on the ice. It guarded the farm. It was a tool for survival and often a companion. To eat the dog meant the hunt was over. It meant the future was gone. It was the last meal before the silence. The people at this farm and across the entire western settlement were starving. And this was just one of the final quiet signs of a collapse that had been happening for centuries. Number 16, they came during a warm spell. Eric the Red was a good marketer. He had to be. He was an outlaw, banished from Norway for manslaughter, then banished from Iceland for the same reason. Around the year 982, he sailed west looking for land a man named Gunnbjorn had spotted a generation earlier. He found it. He spent his 3 years of exile exploring the southwestern coast. He found deep fjords protected from the worst of the Atlantic storms. He found valleys with green pastures fed by glacial meltwater. He saw a land that reminded him of home, of Norway, a better version of the crowded, overgrazed Iceland he had just left. When his exile was up, he sailed back to Iceland to gather settlers. He needed a name for this new place, a name that would draw people. He couldn't call it Land of Ice or Land of Rock. He called it Greenland. He told people it was a rich land, full of promise. He said the grass was green, the hunting was good, and there was land for everyone. It was a lie, or maybe it was just a half-truth. Eric wasn't just lucky in finding the land he was lucky in when he found it. He arrived at the peak of something we now call the medieval warm period. From about 900 to 1300 AD, the North Atlantic was unusually warm. It was a climate anomaly. Sea ice was less extensive. Storms were perhaps less frequent. The growing season in places like Greenland was just long enough. Just warm enough. For a few crucial weeks in the summer, the temperature hovered high enough for hay to grow in the most sheltered valleys. It was possible, just barely, to raise sheep, goats, and even a few precious cattle. Eric's sales pitch worked because the climate was on his side. In 985, a fleet of 25 ships left Iceland, packed with families, livestock, and hope. Only 14 made it. The others were lost to storms or turned back. But those who landed, around 400 to 500 people, found a land that lived up to Eric's promise. They established the eastern settlement in the south, near modern-day Qaqortoq, and the western settlement further north, near Newark. They built their longhouses, divided the land, and, began to farm. They were Norsemen, they were farmers. They brought their way of life with them and stamped it onto this new, empty landscape, but the foundation of their entire society was built on a temporary climate advantage. They didn't know it. How could they? To them, the weather was just the weather. They saw the green valleys and assumed they would always be green. They saw the open sea lanes and assumed they would always be open. They were living in a climatic sweet spot, a lucky bubble in time. All of their assumptions about what was possible in Greenland raising cattle, growing hay, sailing to Europe were based on the weather of the late 10th century. Their whole world was balanced on a knife's edge. A growing season that was maybe 2 weeks shorter could mean not enough hay for the winter. Not enough hay meant killing the livestock. Killing the livestock meant no milk, no cheese, and no breeding stock for the next year. A bit more sea ice could mean the supply ship from Norway couldn't get through. No ship meant no iron, no grain, no news from home. The entire 450-year history of the Norse Greenland colony was an attempt to maintain a European farming lifestyle in an Arctic environment. It only worked because they arrived during a brief, anomalous warm phase. The first and most secret sign of their decline was that their beginning was a historical accident. They built a society on a foundation of warm weather that was destined to disappear. The cold was always waiting. Number 15, they cut down all the trees. When the first settlers arrived with Eric, the landscape they found wasn't completely barren. In the most sheltered inner parts of the fjords, there were woodlands. Not the great forests of Norway, but patches of downy birch and grey-leaf willow. Some trees grew as high as 20 feet. For the Norse, wood was life. You built your house with it. You built your ship with it. You made your bowls, your spoons, your furniture, and your tools with it. You burned it to cook your food and to smelt iron. You burned it to keep from freezing to death in the long, dark winters. So they did what they had always done. They cut down the trees. The first generation of settlers needed wood for their longhouses. A single longhouse required timbers from hundreds of trees. They needed wood to build barns and outbuildings. They needed fences to keep their livestock from wandering, and they needed enormous amounts of firewood. The Greenland winters were far longer and colder than what they were used to in Iceland or Norway. A longhouse fire couldn't be allowed to go out. But the Greenlandic trees were not like European trees. They grew incredibly slowly. The growing season was short, the soil was thin, and the winds were harsh. A birch tree that was only a few inches thick might be 50 years old. The Norse were harvesting a resource that took decades to grow, and they were using it up in a matter of years. Pollen analysis from the bottom of Greenland's lakes tells this story clearly. In the sediment layers from before the year 1000, there's a good amount of birch and willow pollen. Then, right around the time the Norse arrived, the pollen count drops dramatically. It's replaced by the pollen of grasses and weeds, plants that thrive in open, disturbed ground. The settlers cleared the woodlands to create pasture for their sheep and goats. The animals then made sure the trees never grew back. A young sapling trying to poke its head up was a tasty snack for a hungry goat. Within a few generations, the accessible woodlands were gone. This created a series of problems that got worse over time. The first was a critical shortage of building material. When a roof beam rotted, you couldn't just go into the woods and cut a new one. Archaeologists see this in the building. The early longhouses are built with sizable timbers. The later ones are built with smaller, more crooked pieces of wood. They started using more and more turf and stone, not because it was better, but because they had no choice. Large pieces of wood became as precious as gold. The second problem was fuel. With the trees gone, what did they burn? They turned to turf. Cutting turf bricks from the ground became a major part of the summer's work. It was slow, laborious, and it had a devastating effect on the landscape. When you cut away the turf, you expose the thin soil underneath to the wind. The soil blows away, a process called erosion, leaving nothing but bare rock. They were literally burning up the ground that their pastures grew on. The biggest problem, though, was the loss of a vital resource for their connection to the outside world, driftwood. The great rivers of Siberia and North America dump millions of trees into the Arctic Ocean. These logs drift with the currents for years, eventually washing up on the shores of places like Greenland. This driftwood was a godsend. It was often massive timber, perfect for building and repairing ships. The main Norse settlement, the Eastern Settlement, was located on the southwest coast, but the best place to collect driftwood was on the northwest coast, a dangerous journey of hundreds of miles. This journey, the Nordsetter hunt, became a critical part of their economy. They would go north to hunt walrus for ivory and also to gather this essential wood. But as the climate began to cool, this journey became more and more dangerous as sea ice choked the coastline for longer periods. The supply of wood, both local and imported by the sea, began to dry up. They were becoming isolated on an island with no trees, and that was a slow-motion disaster. Number 14, the soil washed away. When Gunnar walked the pastures of his family's farm at Bertalid, it was the year 1250. This was the same land Eric the Red had claimed for himself, the best farmland in the entire colony. Gunnar's great-grandfather had told stories of knee-high grass so thick a man could get lost in it. Now, Gunnar looked to the hillsides and saw something different. He saw patches of bare rock showing through the thin grass. He saw deep gullies cut into the slopes, where the spring meltwater had washed the soil away. The problem started with the sheep. The Norse were pastoralists. Their wealth was in their livestock. The more sheep you had, the richer you were. If sheep provided wool for clothing, milk for cheese, and meat for the table. Every summer, they would let their animals graze freely on the hillsides surrounding their farms. In the first few generations, this worked fine. The land was fresh, but the Greenlandic ecosystem was fragile. It had not evolved with large numbers of grazing animals. The sheep were relentless. They ate the native grasses right down to the root. Their sharp hooves cut into the thin layer of turf, especially on the hillsides. Once the protective plant cover was gone, the soil was exposed. Greenland is a land of wind and water. The strong winds would pick up the dry topsoil and blow it away. In the spring, when the snow melted, the water would run over the bare ground, carrying more soil with it down into the fjords. Every year, a little more of the land disappeared. Archaeologists can see this process in the layers of sediment at the bottom of the lakes. They can drill cores deep into the lake bed and read the history of the landscape. At the bottom of the core, before the Norse arrived, the sediment is dark and organic. After the Norse arrive, the layers change. You start to see thick bands of sand and gravel. That's the soil from the hillsides washed into the lakes. The scientists can even pinpoint the exact years when the erosion was worst. It lines up perfectly with the periods when the Norse population was at its peak. This process, called soil erosion, had a direct impact on Gunnar's life. It meant his pastures could support fewer sheep. The grass that did grow was less nutritious. His animals were smaller and weaker than his grandfather's. This meant less wool, less milk, and less meat. It meant his family was poorer and hungrier. To make up for the poor grazing near the farm, they had to take their animals further and further into the high country in the summer to remote sheelings. This was more work for less reward. The Norse also made the problem worse with their fuel choices. As they ran out of wood, they started burning turf. They would skin the turf off the pasture land, dry it, and burn it. This was like burning your own house to stay warm. The turf was made of the very roots and organic matter that held the soil together. Once you removed it, the land was essentially sterilized. Nothing would grow there again for a very long time. Gunnar didn't understand the long-term ecological processes at play. He just knew that life was getting harder. He knew he had to work twice as hard as his father to get the same yield from the land. He might have blamed it on bad luck, or a couple of dry summers. He wouldn't have understood that the practices that had sustained his family for 200 years were slowly and surely destroying the very foundation of their existence. The land itself was getting thinner, poorer, and less forgiving. Every gust of wind, every spring flood was carrying a tiny piece of their future away. Number 13, their identity was their cage. Astrid sat by the fire in her longhouse near Gardar, the bishop's seat in the eastern settlement. It was the early 1300s. She was mending a woolen tunic for her son Lars. The tunic was thick, and the pattern was complex. It was the proper clothing for a Norseman, the same style people wore in Norway. It was also completely impractical for the reality of their lives. It was too hot for the hard work of summer, and not warm enough for the deep cold of a Greenlandic winter unless you wore many layers, which were heavy and restrictive. Outside, a group of Thule people, the ancestors of the modern Inuit, passed by on the sea ice. Astrid watched them through the smoke hole. They were dressed in clothing made of seal skin and caribou hide. Their parkas had hoods trimmed with fur. Their trousers and boots, called kamiks, were waterproof. Their clothes were light, warm, and perfectly adapted to the Arctic environment. They moved with an ease that Astrid's people had lost. Lars, her son, saw them too. He was fascinated by the Skraelings, as the Norse called them. He had seen their kayaks so fast and silent in the water. He had seen their harpoons with the toggling heads, a brilliant invention for hunting seals. He had once asked his father, "Why don't we build boats like theirs? Why don't we hunt with their spears?" His father's face had grown dark. "We are not Skraelings," he had said, and the tone in his voice meant the conversation was over. "We are farmers, we are Christians from Norway, we build in stone, we herd sheep, we are not hunters who live in snow houses." That was the core of the problem. The Greenland Norse were trapped by their own identity. They saw themselves as Europeans, as farmers who happened to live in Greenland. They were not Arctic people. They stubbornly held on to a way of life that was failing them because it was the only way of life they valued. Their cultural pride was a cage. Archaeological evidence shows this stubbornness in stark detail. In the middens of the Norse farms, you find the bones of sheep, goats, and caribou. You also find seal bones, but the seals they hunted were mostly the smaller, easier to catch species that came close to shore. In the middens of the Thule people, just a few miles away, you find the bones of the large, fat, rich, ringed and bearded seals that live on the outer ice. The Thule had the technology, the kayaks, the harpoons, the knowledge of the ice to hunt these animals effectively. The Norse did not, and more importantly, they showed very little interest in learning. There is almost no evidence of cultural exchange. You don't find Thule-style tools on Norse farms, you don't find Norse iron tools in Thule camps. The two groups seem to have lived side by side for centuries with a mixture of minor trade, avoidance, and occasional hostility. The Norse looked down on the Thule as heathens, primitives. They were unable to see them as survivors, as people who had mastered the art of living in the Arctic. This refusal to adapt was a death sentence. When the climate got colder, the hay harvest failed more often. The pastures degraded, their European farming model became less and less viable. The logical thing to do would have been to shift their focus, to become primarily marine hunters like their neighbors. To learn to build kayaks, to perfect the art of hunting on the ice, to adopt the warm, practical clothing of the Thule, but they couldn't. To do so would have meant ceasing to be Norse. It would have meant admitting that their entire way of life, the one their ancestors brought from Norway, was a failure. So they clung to it. They wore their woolen clothes. They struggled to feed their few remaining cattle. They prayed in their stone churches. They saw themselves as civilized people in a savage land holding out against the wilderness. They failed to understand that in the Arctic, the only way to survive is to become part of the wilderness, not to fight it. Their identity was more important to them than their survival. For number 12, they paid taxes in stone. The Bishop of Gardar stood on the hill overlooking the fjord. It was around 1260. Below him, dozens of men were working. They were quarrying massive blocks of red sandstone from the hillside. They were shaping them with what few iron tools they had. They were hauling them on wooden sledges to the site of the new cathedral. It was backbreaking, dangerous work. The cathedral would be a magnificent building, the finest in Greenland. It would have a stone bell tower, imported stained glass windows, and a bronze bell cast in Norway. It would be a testament to their faith and their connection to Christian Europe. It was also a terrible waste of resources. The Greenland colony was a small, struggling community on the edge of the world. Every calorie of energy, every hour of labor was precious. And a huge amount of that labor was being diverted into building and maintaining churches. The Greenlanders were devout Catholics. The church was the center of their social and spiritual life, but the church also demanded a heavy price. The colony was a bishopric with its own bishop appointed by the Pope, an office based at Gardar in the eastern settlement. This meant the Greenlanders had to support not just their local parish priests, but a whole ecclesiastical hierarchy. They had to pay tithes. In Europe, tithes were paid in grain or silver. In Greenland, they had neither. So they paid in their most valuable export products, walrus tusks, sealskins, and hides. A portion of the best goods from every hunting trip every year went to the church. But the biggest drain was the building boom. Starting in the 12th century, the Norse began replacing their small turf and timber churches with large, imposing stone structures. There were at least 12 parish churches, 2 convents, and the great cathedral at Gardar. Building these churches was a monumental undertaking. Think of the manpower. Men who should have been hunting, fishing, or cutting hay for the winter were instead quarrying stone. The best remaining timber in the colony was used for the roofs and scaffolding. Precious resources that were needed for survival were being poured into these symbols of piety. The cathedral at Gardar is a perfect example. It was about 27 meters long and 16 meters wide. Its walls were 1.5 meters thick. Archaeologists estimate it took thousands of man-hours to build. It was a Northern European cathedral built in the middle of the Arctic. It was a statement. It said, "We are part of Christendom, we are not savages," but it was a statement they could not afford. This wasn't just about faith, it was also about social status. The big chieftains, the heads of the most powerful families, funded the construction of these churches. It was a way for them to display their wealth and power, just as it was in Norway and Iceland. They competed to see who could build the grandest church. This internal competition further drained the colony's limited resources. While the chieftains built bigger churches, the common farmer struggled with a shrinking hayfield and a thinning flock of sheep. The church also owned some of the best farmland in the colony. The bishop's farm at Gardar was the largest and richest in all of Greenland. These church lands were worked by tenant farmers who paid rent to the bishop. This concentrated wealth and power in the hands of the church and took it out of the hands of the people who were doing the hard work of survival. In the end, the stone churches stood as proud and lonely monuments. They were built to last forever. The people who built them, however, were running out of time. The effort spent quarrying stone for God could have been spent hunting seals for their children. On number 11, the world was getting colder. Solveig huddled deeper into her wool cloak. It was the year 1320. She stood on the shore of the fjord, watching her husband and sons haul their boat onto the land. The ice had come early this year. The thin sheet of Sikkosak, the new sea ice, was already forming across the fjord's surface. A few weeks ago, the water had been open. Now it was closing up for the winter. The season for sailing and fishing was over. It seemed to be getting shorter every year. Solveig's grandmother used to tell stories about the old days. She spoke of long, warm summers where the hay grew tall and the butter was yellow and rich. She remembered autumns where the sea was clear of ice well into October. Solveig's reality was different. Her summers were often cool and wet. Sometimes the first snow came in August. Her hay crop was thin and sparse. The butter her family churned was pale and white, a sign that the cows were eating stored fodder, not fresh grass. Solveig and her family didn't know it, but they were living through the beginning of a global climate shift. The medieval warm period, the benevolent climate that had allowed the Norse to settle Greenland, was over. The world was sliding into a period of prolonged cold, known as the Little Ice Age. For people living in continental Europe, the Little Ice Age meant colder winters and failed harvests. For the Norse in Greenland, it was a catastrophe. The evidence for this climate change is locked away in the Greenland ice sheet. Scientists have drilled deep ice cores, pulling up cylinders of ice that contain a record of the climate going back thousands of years. By analyzing the oxygen isotopes in the ice, they can reconstruct the temperature year by year. The ice cores show a clear and dramatic cooling trend starting around the year 1300. The drop in average temperature was only a degree or two, but in a place as marginal as Greenland, that was enough. This small drop in temperature had huge consequences. The first was a shorter growing season. The hay for the livestock had less time to grow. This meant smaller harvests. Smaller harvests meant they couldn't support as many animals over the long winter. This led to a spiral of decline. Fewer cattle meant less milk and cheese. Fewer sheep meant less wool. The very basis of their farming economy was crumbling. The second consequence was the increase in sea ice. The colder temperatures meant that the pack ice that drifted down from the Arctic Ocean became thicker and more extensive. It blocked the shipping lanes for longer periods. The journey from Norway, already dangerous, became nearly impossible. It also made their local hunting much more difficult. In the old days, they could hunt seals from their boats in the open water of the fjords for much of the year. Now, the fjords were choked with ice for 7 or 8 months. Hunting seals at their breathing holes in the ice required a whole different set of skills and tools. Skills the Thule had perfected, but the Norse had not. The cooling climate also affected their main source of cache walrus ivory. The walrus hunting grounds, the Nordresetter, were far to the north. As the ice expanded, the journey to these grounds became more perilous. The walruses themselves may have moved their haul-out sites in response to the changing ice conditions. The supply of their most important export began to dwindle right at the time they needed it most. Solveig didn't know about ice cores or global climate trends. She just knew her reality. She knew the cold seemed to seep into the walls of the longhouse earlier each autumn. She knew the faces of her children were thinner than her own were at their age. She knew the stories of her grandmother sounded like tales from a different, warmer world. The world was changing, growing colder, and it was leaving them behind. Number 10. The sea reclaimed the pastures. Bjorn stood on the shore near his farm in the eastern settlement. It was a calm day in the late 1200s. He was looking at the remains of an old stone wall. The wall had once enclosed a small pasture right by the water's edge, and his grandfather had built it. Now, the wall was half submerged. At high tide, it disappeared completely beneath the waves. The pasture once protected was now a saltwater marsh. The good grass was gone, replaced by sea pinks and sedges that his sheep wouldn't touch. It seemed like the land was sinking, or the sea was rising. Year by year, the high tide mark crept a little further up the shore. The low-lying fields that were once the best, most fertile pastures were becoming boggy and useless. And it was a slow, almost imperceptible change, a few inches a decade, but over a lifetime it added up. A farm that could support a large family in his grandfather's time could now barely support his own. This wasn't just Bjorn's imagination. The land in southwestern Greenland really was sinking. It's a geological process called isostatic subsidence, and it's a bit complicated, but it works like this. During the last Great Ice Age, Greenland was covered by an immense ice sheet far larger than the one that exists today. The weight of all that ice, miles thick, was so great that it literally pushed the land down, depressing the Earth's crust into the semi-molten mantle below. As the Great Ice Age ended and the ice began to melt, the land, freed from this immense weight, began to slowly rebound to rise back up. This is called isostatic rebound. However, the Greenland ice sheet didn't melt uniformly. While the center of the ice sheet thinned, the edges actually grew in some places as more snow accumulated. The Greenland ice sheet is like a giant mass sitting on a seesaw. The land directly under the main ice sheet is still slowly rising, but the land around the edges, where the Norse had their settlements, was on the other end of the seesaw. As the ice mass shifted and grew in the highlands, the coastal areas were pushed down. The Norse had unknowingly settled on a slowly sinking coastline. They built their farms on the low, flat land at the heads of the fjords, the best land for farming. For the first couple of centuries, the effect was minimal. But as the centuries wore on and the process of subsidence continued, it began to have a real impact. Archaeologists have found the ruins of Norse farmsteads that are now partially or completely underwater. They have found boat sheds that are now located far from the current shoreline because the sea has retreated in some areas, and boat sheds that are now submerged because the sea has advanced in others. The entire landscape was tilting and changing, and the Norse were caught in the middle. For Bjorn, this geological process was a practical disaster. The best pastures were always the ones near the sea. They were flatter, had deeper soil, and benefited from the moderating effect of the water. As these prime lands were lost to the rising sea, the Norse were forced to rely on the poorer, thinner soils of the inland hillsides. This put even more pressure on an agricultural system that was already struggling. Losing this land was a double blow. Not only did they lose the grazing, but they also lost a crucial source of fertilizer. The Norse would collect seaweed from the shore at low tide and spread it on their fields to enrich the soil. As the coastline changed and the best low-lying areas were flooded, this resource also became harder to access. The sinking land was another quiet, relentless pressure, another factor in the slow tightening of the noose around the colony. They were losing their world inch by inch to the sea. Number 9. They grew smaller with each generation. In the churchyard at Gardar, the bishop's seat, hundreds of skeletons lay buried. They were the people of the eastern settlement, from the first settlers to the last. When archaeologists excavated these cemeteries in the 20th century, the bones began to tell a story that the sagas left out. It was a story of a slow, creeping hunger. The scientists who studied these skeletons could read a person's life in their bones. They could determine their age, their sex, and their general health, and when they compared the skeletons from the early settlement period around the year 1000 with those from the later period after 1300, a disturbing trend emerged. The people were getting shorter. The average height of a man buried in the early period was about 5 feet 7 inches, not much different from men in Scandinavia at the time. The women were also of a comparable height to their European counterparts. They were a healthy, robust people. But the skeletons from the 14th and 15th centuries painted a different picture. The average height for a man had dropped to just 5 feet 3 inches. The women were even smaller. This wasn't a genetic change. It was the mark of chronic, multi-generational malnutrition. From the moment they were born, the later generations of Greenland Norse were not getting enough to eat. Or at least not enough of the right things. Their diet was becoming less varied and less nutritious. A child who doesn't get enough protein and calories during their growing years will not reach their full potential height. Their bones will literally be smaller. The skeletons showed other signs of hardship. Many had signs of anemia, a deficiency of iron, which you would expect in a diet lacking red meat. Many of the teeth were worn down to the gums. This was partly from grit and sand in their food, but also from using their teeth as tools for softening hides or holding things. Desperate people used their bodies in hard ways. The bones of the women showed the strain of a lifetime of hard physical labor. The skeletons of children and infants showed high rates of mortality. Life was getting harder, shorter, and more painful. One of the most revealing discoveries was what they were eating. By analyzing the chemical isotopes in the bones, scientists can tell what a person's diet consisted of. In the early period, the Norse had a mixed diet. About 20 to 40% of their food came from the sea fish and seal. The rest came from the land, the meat and dairy from their sheep, goats, and cattle. This was the diet of a European farmer supplemented by the sea. By the 1400s, this had changed dramatically. The bone chemistry of the last Greenlanders shows that up to 80% of their diet was coming from the sea. They had almost completely abandoned their land-based pastoral economy. They were no longer farmers who hunted. They were desperate hunters living almost exclusively on seals. This might sound like a successful adaptation. They were turning to the sea for survival as their farms failed. But it wasn't enough. The skeletons prove it. Despite this massive shift in their diet, they were still malnourished. They were getting smaller, sicker, and dying younger. They had the wrong tools, the wrong techniques, and the wrong social structure to be full-time Arctic marine hunters. They were trying to live like the Thule, but they didn't know how. They had given up their old identity as farmers, but they had failed to successfully adopt a new one. The result was a population that was slowly wasting away, growing smaller with each passing generation, until they finally disappeared. Number 8. A rusty nail was a treasure. Catil was repairing the wall of his longhouse. It was the autumn of 1380. A strong wind had loosened one of the main roof supports, a precious piece of driftwood his grandfather had hauled from the northern hunting grounds. The beam needed to be secured before the winter storms arrived. What he needed was a long iron nail. This was a simple problem that had become almost impossible to solve. Kettle walked to his small wooden chest, where he kept his tools. He had a few knife blades, a worn-out axe head, and a handful of bent, rusty nails he had saved over the years. None of them were big enough for this job. In his great-grandfather's time, this wouldn't have been a problem. At least once a year, a ship, the Nar, would arrive from Norway. It would bring supplies the colonists couldn't make themselves. Grain for making ale, church bells, and vestments, and most importantly, iron. It would arrive in the form of blanks, rough bars of smelted iron that a blacksmith could then work into whatever was needed: axe heads, knives, spear points, cauldrons, and nails. Hundreds and hundreds of nails, but the ships had stopped coming, or they came so rarely that they might as well have stopped. The last ship anyone could remember had arrived more than a decade ago. The trade link with Norway, the colony's lifeline, was broken. And so the supply of new iron had been cut off. The Greenlanders were, living in an iron-starved world. Iron was essential for their way of life. They were farmers who used iron scythes to cut their hay. They were builders who used iron axes and saws. They were hunters who used iron-tipped spears. Without a steady supply, their entire technological base began to crumble. Archaeologists see this desperation in the artifacts they find. On Norse sites, they find very few discarded iron objects. Why? Because nothing was ever discarded. When a tool broke, it was repaired. When it couldn't be repaired, it was melted down and reforged into something else. An old sword might become a set of new knives. A broken axe head would be reworked into a smaller hammer. They became master recyclers. They would even dig into the walls of old, abandoned longhouses to scavenge for nails left behind by previous generations. A single nail was a valuable object. It would be carefully straightened and reused until it was nothing but a nub of rust. When they couldn't make new nails, they started using wooden pegs or complex joinery to hold their buildings together. This was weaker and less efficient. The scarcity of iron also affected their ability to hunt. A wooden spear might kill a caribou, but for hunting seals or the occasional polar bear, an iron-tipped weapon was far superior. As their tools dulled and could not be replaced, their effectiveness as hunters declined. Kettle spent the rest of the day searching. He remembered a story his father told him about an old turf wall near the edge of their property that had been part of a much older building, one of the first in the area. He took a small shovel and began to dig. Hours later, just as the light was failing, his shovel hit something hard. He knelt down and pulled it from the earth. It was a long, thick iron nail, bent and heavily rusted, but still solid. It was from a building that had been a ruin for 200 years. He held it in his hand as if it were a jewel. That night, he carefully built up his fire, using precious charcoal he saved for smithing. He heated the nail until it glowed red, and, with a smooth stone for an anvil and a smaller one for a hammer, he painstakingly tapped it straight. It was a whole evening's work for a single nail. The next day, he would use it to save his house. This was the reality of the late 14th century in Greenland. A society that had once built ocean-going ships was now struggling to produce a single nail. The Iron Age was ending for them, and they were sliding back into a world of stone and bone. Number 7, they ignored their neighbors. The Thule family had set up their winter camp on a small island in the fjord, a few miles from the Norse farm at Anavik. It was the mid-13th century. The two groups were aware of each other. The Norse farmers would see the Thule hunters out on the ice, patiently waiting by a seal's breathing hole. The Thule would see the strange, large longhouses of the Norse and the odd, four-legged animals they kept in stone pens. They were two different worlds occupying the same space. The Norse were farmers, tied to their land and their livestock. Their year was dictated by the seasons of the pasture planting, haying, and the long winter stall feeding. The Thule were nomadic marine hunters. Their year was dictated by the seasons of the ice and the movements of the animals, the spring seal pup hunt, the summer caribou hunt, the winter ice hunting. The Thule had perfected the art of Arctic survival. Their entire culture was a brilliant adaptation to the harshest environment on Earth. They had the kayak, a fast, stealthy hunting vessel. They had the dog sled for traveling long distances over the ice, or they had the toggling harpoon, which locked into the blubber of a sea mammal, ensuring it could not escape. They had tailored skin clothing that was both warm and waterproof. They knew how to build snow houses for temporary shelter. They knew how to find and store food through the darkest parts of winter. They had everything the Norse needed to know to survive what was coming. And the Norse, for the most part, completely ignored them. The archaeological record is shockingly clear on this point. In the excavated ruins of the Norse settlements, you find almost no thule technology, no pieces of kayaks, no toggling harpoons, no ulu knives. Similarly, in the thule sites, you find very few Norse artifacts. A few scraps of metal, perhaps a piece of a pot, but very little to suggest any meaningful trade or interaction. The written records, though sparse, support this picture of mutual avoidance. The Icelandic annals mention a few encounters, some of them violent. One saga refers to the native people as Skraelings and describes them as small, hostile people who used magic. The Norse clearly saw them as an inferior, even threatening presence. They were other. This was a catastrophic failure of imagination. The Norse were facing a series of escalating problems. Their climate was getting colder, their farms were failing, their connection to Europe was breaking down. Right in front of them was a group of people who had solved all of these problems. The Norse could have learned from them. They could have traded with them. They could have intermarried with them. They could have slowly, over generations, adopted the technologies and strategies that would have allowed them to thrive in the changing Arctic. But their cultural arrogance, their deep-seated belief in their own superiority as European Christians prevented them. They were farmers, not hunters. They were civilized, not Skraelings. To adopt Thule ways would have been to admit defeat, to lose their own identity. So they stuck to their failing model. They continued to try to raise sheep on dwindling pastures. They continued to wear their heavy, impractical woolen clothes. They continued to hunt seals from clumsy rowboats instead of nimble kayaks. There's a single poignant exception that proves the rule. At one farm site in the Western Settlement, archaeologists found a small carved wooden figure of a man. He's wearing a hooded parka, clearly in the style of the Thule. It's a tiny, tantalizing hint that at least one person was paying attention. Perhaps it was a child's toy. Perhaps it was an object of curiosity, but it was a rare crack in the wall of indifference that separated the two cultures. And for the colony as a whole, that wall remained standing until the very end. They chose to fail on their own terms rather than to succeed on someone else's. Number 6, their only link to the world snapped. Ivar Bardarson was a Norwegian priest. Sometime around the year 1341, he was sent to Greenland to serve as the steward of the Bishop of Gardar's estate. He lived in the Eastern Settlement for many years. Later in his life, he wrote a description of Greenland, a kind of guide for the Norwegian crown. His report is one of the last detailed accounts we have of the living Norse colony, and it contains a chilling passage. Bardarson writes that at some point during his time in Greenland, he was sent on an expedition to the Western Settlement. The Western Settlement was the smaller, more northerly of the two colonies. The people there had always had it harder. The land was more marginal, the winters longer. The authorities in the Eastern Settlement had heard nothing from them for some time. They were worried. The purpose of Bardarson's trip was to help the settlers against the Skraelings. So Ivar and his men sailed the long, dangerous journey north. When they arrived at the heart of the Western Settlement, they found the farms were empty, the longhouses stood silent, the churches were abandoned, the people had vanished. The entire Western Settlement, a community that had existed for over 350 years with a population of perhaps 1,000 people, was gone. This wasn't a slow decline, this was a sudden, catastrophic collapse. What happened to them? Bardarson's account gives no clear answer. He mentions the Skraelings, but there is no archaeological evidence of a great war or massacre. The farms weren't burned. The skeletons found from this period don't show signs of widespread violence. The best theory is that the Western Settlement simply reached a breaking point. The colder climate of the 14th century hit them first and hardest. A series of bad years, a failed hay harvest, a winter with unusually heavy ice. Their farming economy, always fragile, completely collapsed. Faced with starvation, they had a choice. They could stay and die, or they could leave. But where could they go? Some may have tried to sail away. A boat full of starving people setting out into the North Atlantic had little chance of survival. Some may have tried to assimilate with the Thule, though there is no evidence for this. The most likely scenario is that most of them simply died. They starved in their longhouses over a few hard winters. The survivors, a small desperate group, may have packed what they could and tried to sail back to the eastern settlement or even to Iceland or Norway. We don't know. The historical record is silent. The collapse of the western settlement around 1350 was a devastating blow to the colony as a whole. It was a sign that their way of life was no longer sustainable, but it also had a huge practical impact. The western settlement was closer to the Nordrsetur, the northern hunting grounds for walrus. With the westerners gone, the journey to collect ivory and driftwood became even longer and more dangerous for the people of the eastern settlement. The disappearance of an entire community should have been a wake-up call. It should have told the remaining Greenlanders that they needed to change, and change radically if they were to survive. But the message may have come too late. The forces of decline were already too powerful. The eastern settlement was now alone, a shrinking island of Norse culture in a vast and unforgiving Arctic. The silence from the north was a preview of the silence that would eventually envelop them all. Number 5, their money lost its value. Olaf the trader stood on the docks in Bergen, Norway. It was the year 1390. A ship had just arrived from Iceland, and with it, news. But there was no news from Greenland. No one on the docks was surprised. The Greenland Nar, the official ship that was supposed to make the trip, hadn't sailed in years. The Greenland trade was no longer a priority for the Norwegian crown. It was too dangerous, too expensive, and what the Greenlanders had to offer was no longer worth the trouble. For centuries, the Greenland colony had survived because it had one thing that Europe desperately wanted: walrus ivory. The tusks of the Atlantic walrus were a luxury good, prized for carving into chess pieces, crucifixes, and other fine objects. It was known as Northern Gold. The Greenlanders had a near monopoly on the supply. The annual walrus hunt in the far north was the cornerstone of their economy. They would trade the tusks for iron, grain, wood, and all the other things they couldn't produce themselves. The tithes to the church, even to the Pope in Rome, were often paid in walrus tusks. But in the 14th century, the market for their one valuable product collapsed. This happened for several reasons. First, the supply started to dry up. The Little Ice Age made the northern hunting grounds harder to reach. The walrus populations themselves may have shifted due to the changing ice conditions. The disappearance of the western settlement, which was closer to the hunting grounds, made the entire enterprise more difficult for the remaining eastern settlers. Second, the demand in Europe changed. New trade routes opened up, bringing elephant ivory from Africa and Asia into the European market. Elephant ivory was larger, easier to carve, and didn't have the yellowish tint that walrus ivory often did. It was seen as a superior product. Suddenly, the luxury market was flooded with a better, cheaper alternative. The value of walrus ivory plummeted. The Greenlanders were left with a product that nobody wanted anymore. Imagine being a farmer whose only cash crop is suddenly worthless. Your ability to buy the things you need to survive is gone. This economic collapse happened at the worst possible time. It coincided with other disasters. In 1349, the Black Death swept through Norway. It killed up to half the population. The social and economic structure of the country was shattered. Norway, which was already in a political union with Denmark and losing its independence, simply didn't have the resources or the will to maintain its remote, unprofitable colony in Greenland. The ships stopped sailing. The institutional memory of how to even navigate to Greenland began to fade. The Greenlanders were cut off. They were used to being on the periphery, but now the center had disappeared. They had always thought of themselves as part of a larger European world. They paid their taxes, they followed the bishop, they dressed in European styles, but that world had forgotten them. Olaf the trader turned away from the docks. He had his own problems. The price of fish was down. The German merchants of the Hanseatic League were controlling all the trade in Bergen. He spared a brief thought for the farmers in Greenland. He wondered what they were doing now that their tusks were worthless. He pictured them on their remote farms waiting for a ship that would never come. He was right. The silence from Greenland wasn't just because the sea lanes were choked with ice. It was also because nobody in Europe was listening anymore. Number 4, they dressed for a world that no longer existed. In the year 1400, in the churchyard at Herjolfsnes, a farmstead near the southern tip of Greenland, a woman was buried. She was laid to rest in her finest clothes, as was the custom. When archaeologists excavated her grave centuries later, they found something remarkable. The permafrost had preserved her clothing almost perfectly. She was wearing a long, light-colored woolen gown. It was a sophisticated piece of tailoring with a fitted bodice and a long, flowing skirt. Over it, she wore a hooded cape, also made of wool. The hood was long and pointed, and the cape was decorated with a narrow woven band. On her head, she wore a distinctive cap, a tall, cylindrical hat with a flattened top. It was the height of fashion in Paris in the late 14th century. The style of her clothes was almost identical to the styles seen in European manuscripts and paintings from that period. Here, at the absolute edge of the European world, in a tiny, struggling colony, was a woman who was dressed in the latest continental fashion. This discovery, and others like it at Herjolfsnes, is one of the most poignant signs of the Greenlanders' decline. It shows a community desperately clinging to a European identity, even as the world that defined that identity was slipping away. Think about the practicality of her clothes. She was wearing a heavy woolen gown in an Arctic environment. It would have been difficult to work in. It was not nearly as warm or as waterproof as the sealskin clothing worn by the Thule. The tall, elaborate hat served no practical purpose at all. It was purely a fashion statement. Making these clothes required an enormous investment of resources. The wool had to be sheared from their ever-dwindling flocks of sheep. It had to be cleaned, carded, spun into thread, and then woven into cloth on a large, upright loom. This was all women's work, and it took thousands of hours. The patterns were complex and required great skill. All this effort, all these precious resources were being poured into creating clothes that were a statement of cultural identity, not a practical adaptation to their environment. The clothes from Herjolfsnes show that even at this late stage, the Greenlanders were not isolated from European culture. They knew what the current fashions were. Perhaps a single ship had made it through in the past decade, bringing news and patterns, and they were determined to keep up. They wanted to prove, perhaps mostly to themselves, that they were still fashionable, civilized Europeans. But this focus on fashion was a distraction from their real problems. The hours spent weaving a fashionable gown were hours not spent mending fishing nets or preparing sealskins. The wool used for a decorative cape was wool that could have been used to make another, warmer layer of clothing for a child. The woman in the grave at Herjolfsnes represents the tragedy of the Greenland Norse. She was not a primitive person struggling for survival. She was a sophisticated European who found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time. She and her community were facing an existential crisis, a complete failure of their way of life. And their response was to focus on the things that made them feel normal, the things that connected them to a world that had largely forgotten them. In fact, they were dressing for a party that had ended hundreds of years ago. Number 3, they refused to eat fish. The fjord was full of fish. In the summer, Arctic char ran up the rivers in such numbers that the water seemed to boil with them. In the deep, cold waters of the fjord, cod and halibut were plentiful. The sea around Greenland was, and still is, one of the richest fishing grounds in the world. For a community facing starvation, this should have been an inexhaustible source of food, yet the Norse Greenlanders seem to have largely ignored it. When archaeologists examine the trash heaps, the middens of the Norse farms, they find a surprisingly small number of fish bones. For every 1,000 seal bones, they might find only a handful of fish bones. This is one of the great puzzles of the Greenland colony. Why, in a land of failing farms and dwindling livestock, did they not turn to the sea and become fishermen? The answer, like so many things about the Norse, seems to lie in their identity. They were not fishermen, or they were farmers, they were cattlemen and shepherds. In the culture of medieval Scandinavia, eating fish was often seen as a sign of poverty. It was what you ate when you couldn't afford beef or mutton. A great chieftain, a powerful farmer, would show his wealth by serving meat and dairy products from his own land. To be reduced to eating fish was to lose status. It seems this cultural prejudice was carried with them to Greenland and was maintained for centuries. They were willing to hunt seals because that was seen as a noble, dangerous pursuit, but the day-to-day work of fishing seems to have been beneath them. There may have been practical reasons as well. Deep-sea fishing in the North Atlantic is dangerous. It requires sturdy, well-maintained boats. As the colony's supply of wood dwindled, it became harder and harder to build and repair their boats. They also lacked the kind of fishing technology like long lines and deep water nets that would have allowed them to exploit the resource effectively. The Thule, by contrast, were skilled fishermen using ingenious lures and leasters, a type of spear to catch fish through the ice in winter. Again, the Norse seem to have been unwilling to learn from their neighbors. This avoidance of fish had dire consequences for their health. The skeletons from the late period show high rates of malnutrition. A diet rich in fish would have provided them with protein, oils, and essential vitamins that they were clearly lacking. It's a tragic irony. They were starving to death in a land of plenty because the food that could have saved them was food they were unwilling to eat. This idea is controversial among some scholars. They argue that the fish bones, being smaller and more fragile, simply didn't preserve as well as the larger mammal bones. They point to some recent studies that have found more evidence of fish in the Norse diet than previously thought. But even these studies show that fish never became a central part of their diet, not in the way it was for other North Atlantic cultures like the Icelanders or the Norwegians. The overwhelming impression remains that the Greenlanders had a cultural blind spot when it came to the bounty of the sea. They were locked into a mindset that valued livestock above all else. Even as their cattle were starving for lack of hay, and their children were starving for lack of food, they looked out at a fjord teeming with fish and saw not a solution, but a symbol of failure. This cultural stubbornness, this refusal to see the resource that was right in front of them, was one of the final nails in their coffin. Number 2, the last recorded words were a wedding vow. The stone church at Hvalsey was crowded. It was September 14th, 1408. The church was one of the finest in the eastern settlement, its thick stone walls a testament to the faith and endurance of the Greenlanders. On this day, a wedding was taking place. A man named Thorstein Olafsson was marrying a woman named Sigrid Bjornsdottir. The ceremony was witnessed by the local priest and many members of the community. Also in attendance, by a strange twist of fate, were a group of Icelandic sailors. Their ship had been blown off course on a journey from Norway to Iceland, and had ended up taking shelter in the fjord at Hvalsey. They had been in Greenland for 2 years, waiting for a chance to sail home. The wedding was properly recorded. The banns were published, the vows were exchanged, the documents were signed by the priest and the local lawman. It was all done by the book, a small piece of European legal and religious life playing out on the edge of the known world. In 1410, the Icelandic sailors finally managed to repair their ship and sail back to Iceland. They brought the wedding documents with them. These documents, which still exist in the archives in Iceland, are the last written record from the living Norse Greenland colony. After the wedding of Thorstein and Sigrid, there is only silence. No more ship's logs, no more priest's reports, no more letters home. The connection was cut. The 450-year-old conversation between Greenland and the rest of the world simply ended. What happened to Thorstein and Sigrid? Did they have children? Did they grow old together on their farm? Did they live to see the final collapse of their community? We will never know. They are the last 2 Greenlanders whose names we know, the last 2 people to step out of the fog of history before it closed in for good. The wedding at Hvalsey is so powerful because it is a moment of absolute normalcy in the face of impending doom. Here was a community that by 1408 must have been in a desperate state. The climate was colder, the farms were failing. The ships from Europe were a distant memory, they were isolated, impoverished, and shrinking, and yet they were still getting married. You know, they were still falling in love, having children, and celebrating life's milestones in their stone church. They were carrying on, trying to live normal lives in a world that was becoming increasingly abnormal. The wedding was an act of hope. It was a bet on the future. It was an assertion that life would go on, that their community would endure. But it didn't. We don't know the exact date the last Norse Greenlander died or sailed away. Was it 1450? A papal letter from 1492 expresses concern that the Greenlanders may have fallen away from the faith. But these are just echoes. The reality is that after 1408, the colony disappears from the historical record. It fades into myth and legend. The wedding certificate of Thorstein and Sigrid is like a postcard sent from the edge of oblivion. It's the last word from a lost world, a world that was still trying to be normal right up until the very end. Number 1, they ate their dogs. Magnus knelt beside the dog. It was an old Norwegian elk hound named Rolf. The dog had been his companion for 10 years. Together they had hunted caribou in the high pastures and seals on the winter ice. Rolf was a tool, the most valuable tool Magnus owned. His keen nose could find a seal's breathing hole from 100 yards away. His bark could turn a fleeing caribou. But he was more than a tool. He was the last link to a life that made sense. It was the winter of 1345. Magnus lived on a small farm in the western settlement. The last few years had been hard. The summers were too short to grow enough hay. The fjord had frozen early, cutting off the seal hunt. His last 2 sheep had been taken by a polar bear that wandered down from the north. The family had already slaughtered and eaten their one scrawny cow. Now there was nothing left. The food storage pit was empty. His wife, Inga, was weak. His young son, Eric, had a cough that wouldn't go away. Their faces were thin and pale in the flickering lamplight of the longhouse. The decision had been made in silence. There were no words for this. Magnus had raised Rolf from a pup. The dog trusted him completely. Now, Magnus held a stone axe. He looked at the dog, who thumped his tail weakly against the frozen earth. To eat your dog was to eat your future. The dog was the key to getting more food. Without the dog, the hunt was almost impossible. Killing the dog was an admission that there would be no more hunts. It was an act of final, desperate consumption. It was burning the last of your seed corn to make one more loaf of bread. This scene, which played out in the final years of the Western settlement, is not speculation. It is written in the bones. At archaeological sites like Garden under Sandet, the farm beneath the sand, the evidence is unmistakable. In the deepest, most recent layers of the food middens, dog bones appear, and they are not just tossed aside. They are treated in the same way as the bones of game animals. The long bones are cracked open to get at the nutritious marrow. The skulls are split to get at the brain. The bones show cut marks from knives where the meat was stripped away. These were not dogs that died of old age and were respectfully buried. These were dogs that were butchered and eaten. This is the ultimate sign of a society's collapse. The Norse Greenlanders defined themselves as pastoralists, as herdsmen. Their status was tied to the animals they owned, but the climate and their own poor land management destroyed that model. They were then forced to become hunters, relying on seals and caribou, but they were not very good hunters, not as good as the Thule. And when that strategy failed, when the ice was too thick or the game disappeared, they were left with one last terrible choice. They had to turn on the very animals that were their partners in survival. The decision by Magnus to kill and eat Hrolf was not just about staving off starvation for another week. It was the moment he stopped being a Norseman. All the traditions, all the status, all the rules of his culture had been stripped away by hunger. He was no longer a farmer or a hunter. He was just a man with a starving family making an unthinkable choice in the cold and the dark at the end of the world. The eating of the dogs was the last, secret sign of their decline, because after that, there was nothing left. There was only silence.